Joining our webinar here today. This is going to be focused on specifically grades kindergarten through third grade and preparing teachers for the transition to the new 2022 social studies standards. So hopefully you're in the right place. Just to be clear, this is part of a kind of larger series of webinars that we are running throughout the next few months and into actually the next year. The next one is going to be on October 27th, and there we'll be focusing on grades 4 and 5. Okay, so once again, if you're just joining now, just make sure your camera is off and that you're muted. We just want to save on bandwidth here because there might be quite a few people in this Zoom. And actually, I see a whole bunch of people joining now, so we're just going to give them like 2 more seconds, and then I'll jump in here. But thanks again, everybody, for joining. Okay, looks like it's slowing down, so let's get started. All right, so we're just going to introduce ourselves real quick here. So I am Sean Diamond. I am the social studies lead here in the Office of Teaching and Learning at the Louisiana Department of Education. And I am joined by my wonderful colleague here who's going to be helping with the Zoom and answering questions in chat. I'll let her introduce herself here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chandra Phillips, and I'm the social studies content specialist working with Sean today.
All right. So again, please make sure your camera is off and you're muted. It's cause minimum amount of distractions here as we move through, because there's quite a bit of information we're running through today. Okay, let's get started. So this is going to be a pretty quick webinar here. We got an hour on the clock, but we do have a few different things I'm hoping to accomplish. So I'm just going to really quickly run through these bullet points here. And I'm going to not go in order. So by the end of this session, we're hoping that everyone will be able to describe what supports will be available for K-3 social studies within the next year, and some change there. So what you can expect from the department and beyond, what supports are going to be available for K-3 social studies. 2, we want to identify ways that teachers can begin to prepare for these new standards. And so we're going to outline some different kind of buckets of activities we feel would be appropriate for professional learning for K-3 teachers to, again, prepare them for these new standards. And then maybe most importantly, we're going to spend a good deal of time talking about the connection between social studies in elementary grades and literacy and reading comprehension. And if there's maybe one takeaway from this whole big meeting, I would kind of like it to be that, the importance of social studies and its connection to literacy. So our agenda kind of follows those bullets I just ran through here. So like I said, we're going to update you on what you can kind of expect coming from the department in the next year or so. We'll talk about literacy and social studies. I will actually spend some time going through each of the grades K through 3, and I will talk about the biggest shifts and changes in terms of the skills we're expecting students to learn and master in those grades, and as well as the content that we're expecting. Just not every single change, but the biggest, most salient ones. And then the last 20 minutes or so, we'll talk about these kind of 3 different buckets of things we think would be appropriate for K-3 teachers to focus on in their various professional learning environments at their particular schools. Okay, so updates. First big update is we have a new rubric that the department, in partnership with EdReports, created to review any new submissions we get, any new social studies material submissions we get. All the materials for this webinar that I'm talking about today, you can find in the link that I believe Chandra and I just dropped in chat as well, a PDF of this deck. So you can click through all these links here. So we have a new rubric for reviewing. We are really proud of this work. We think it kind of walks this line between pushing for publishers to develop really high quality materials in social studies, but isn't utopian or going to lead to zero submissions being found being high quality here. So I would just want to make everyone aware we are accepting submissions for new social studies materials as publishers submit. That is made available in the weekly report that the IMR team puts out. And we do expect some submissions this cycle and certainly more next cycle. I would just want everyone to take a look at the rubric, because I think, if you look at each of the indicators, it's hopefully clear what we think really good social studies materials looks like and the different components that they should have. I'm not going to get into super specifics here, just get updating. We have this new awesome rubric. We're accepting new submissions and new materials. We hope to review something as soon as is possible. All right, moving on. So from the Teacher Leader Summit, probably the biggest piece of information we put out was that we were working on replacements for the scope and sequence documents for grades K through 8, history and civics, that we were calling our course frameworks. Right, so that certainly applies to K3. We're actually looking at the front page of the 3rd grade one right now. We are still planning on doing this. We've engaged with many different teachers through the Teacher Leader Advisor program at the department to help us build these. Our estimated kind of delivery time on these, of having them all completed, K through 8 in the high school courses, will be spring, summer 2023, probably mid to late April. But we are going to release these as we complete them. So I guess you could say on a rolling basis. And again, you'll find all this on the social studies landing page on Louisiana Believes, in that box that says implementation. There'll be some larger changes coming to that page as the new standards are implemented and the old standards are phased out. And just to reiterate, though these are a replacement for the scope and sequence, they are not exactly like the scope and sequence documents. Right, we're offering, we're not going to have a scripted lesson plan, at least in this initial version. Instead, what we're offering is, units, topics, and pacing. And then for each topic, we're organizing all of the instructional materials around a big framing question that students work up to answering, smaller discrete supporting questions, and then a series of primary and secondary sources to actually answer those supporting questions. One of the pieces of feedback we got at the summit was, in terms of just organizationally how we were laying these out, that having individual files for all the images for every supporting question is just needlessly hard for teachers then to pull together to build a deck or to build student-facing materials out of. So instead, we're actually going to have all of the images for any given supporting question in a single slide deck. So that should just be easier, more user-friendly to use. So again, the field can expect completed course frameworks for kindergarten through 3rd grade, spring, summer 2023, like I said, probably around mid-April. Okay. And then the third update is we are continuing to work on what we're calling this kind of bank of instructional strategies and activities as they pertain to social studies classrooms. Same delivery time as our course frameworks in the spring of 2023. These will be somewhat similar to what's on offer in English language arts, where it's like this one page of kind of like, what is this strategy or activity, how to implement it in the classroom, some videos showing you how it would actually kind of look and sound and feel. We know that we're going to cover certain strategies here. Among them are going to be tools and protocols to help kids contextualize sources, annotating in social studies, how to run not just classroom debates, but different kinds of deliberative discussions, and as well as guidance on reading aloud in social studies, which is certainly going to affect our K-3 teachers and students. So again, you can look for more information about this shortly, but we'll have this completed and posted in spring 2023. Okay, so those are kind of the three just updates on what the department is planning on offering. Nothing should be earth-shattering here. Just wanted to reiterate some of the stuff we mentioned at Summit and give slight updates on the timeline. Here's actually an example of one of the tools we're working on for contextualizing. So what this will be is like, a very simple kind of graphic organizer that students can apply to a whole bunch of different topics and learning. But here, what they would do is they would record whatever question they're trying to answer or whatever claim they're ultimately trying to make. They would list out what different historical events, processes, or persons they're thinking about. But then to help them get in the habit of contextualizing these things, we would have them create a very simple timeline where they would try and find an event, before and after the thing they're currently learning about. So they can kind of place it and start to build that chronology in their head, as well as then place that event, process, and person on a map, right? Whether that's a map of the world or Louisiana or the United States will depend on the grade. But this is something we've seen in some social studies materials we really think are really high quality, and we kind of want to duplicate it here in Louisiana. Okay, now to shift gears a little wildly from updates here, I want to talk more broadly about and kind of make just a plea for how important we think it is to spend time, to have dedicated time, which I know is not easy. And there's a lot of competing interests in K-3 space here, but the importance of having time spent on social studies in early elementary school and the connection that has to literacy and reading comprehension. So kind of headline, my big claim here is that, and I hope we can prove we can support it in the next 10 minutes here, is that dedicated time for social studies in elementary school will support and not detract from the development of literacy and reading comprehension, right? I know it can often seem like a burden to spend additional time on this, and you could say, hey, my ELA curriculum already has a really rich nonfiction texts, and students are getting some of this there, and that's true potentially and great, but I don't know if that's the same thing as having dedicated time for specifically for social studies. And really, we think that's because reading historical texts or looking at photographs or various other types of primary sources really helps students build a broad foundation of knowledge about the world that sets the condition for reading comprehension. All right. Notice I said sets the condition. I want to kind of elaborate on that there. And to do this, I just want to kind of take a big step back and just talk about reading, the process of reading in general. So it's sometimes tempting to think about reading as a skill, right? A skill like riding a bike. Once you learn to ride one bike, you can ride any bike. Your ability transfers from one bike to another. Same thing with reading, right? Kind of, sort of. It's certainly a part of reading, a part we usually call decoding, and that's absolutely a transferable skill, right? I think we can kind of prove it to you here in a real quick exercise here. So I hope you see this word on the screen here. I'm going to pronounce it. Churbit, I think would be probably correct. I hope we can all agree. And if I just randomly, added an E to the end of this word, it would be churbite. Neither one of these words is real. I just made them up. But we can all agree on how to pronounce them because there is a written code to our language that you can learn, practice, and master. That's a skill, a transferable skill, and you can apply it to things you've never heard or read before. That's usually called decoding, right? And is that all there is to reading? I don't think so, right? So let's look at another word. Humor me here. This is actually a real word, but I'm hoping one that nobody is familiar with. I tried to pick something real strange. So this word is pronounced excrescence, all right? And so we're going to read a few sentences with this word in it to see if we can begin to determine its meaning here. So humor me, I'm going to read these sentences here. To calculate fuel efficiency, the airplane engineers needed an accurate estimation of the excrescence drag caused by the shape of the plane's cabin. Excrescences on the valve of the heart have been known to cause a stroke. Let's try two more. Maybe you're starting to get an idea. The wart, a small excrescence on his skin, had made Jeremy self-conscious for years. At the far end of the meadow was what at first glance I thought a huge domed building, but then saw it was an excrescence in the cliff itself. Okay, so I'm hoping that some of you are beginning to kind of potentially tease out what this word might mean. Right, an excrescence is a projection or an outgrowth, right? Especially if it's abnormal. This is a super accelerated example of how our learned learning occurs. The general sense of a word gets narrowed down each time you encounter it until it's added to your working vocabulary. But think about all the other words you had to know that enabled you to guess what this word might be, right? You knew, I'm guessing here, but you probably knew what the words, stroke, engineer, warp. You didn't have to stop and think about what self-conscious meant, right? You're already rich in knowledge and vocabulary, and I guess you know excrescence, so you're a little bit richer. But if you didn't, right, you kind of fell a little bit further behind, and researchers have sometimes taken to calling this effect the Matthew effect, and I'm going to expound on this a little bit more here. So everything a child sees and hears contributes to their reading comprehension, and the effect is cumulative, right? So students who are rich in knowledge and language tend to get richer because knowledge builds on knowledge and language builds on language, right? Thus this Matthew effect, right, from this biblical passage here. In plain English, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So if you visit nearly any ELA classroom in Louisiana, and more likely the country, you're going to see statements like this, right? Good readers ask questions. Good readers create pictures in their minds. Good readers make connections when they read. Of course, this is great. Teachers are modeling what good readers do, but it's not enough to teach students what good readers do. We got to teach them what good readers know, right? Your ability to make meaning is not a skill like decoding you can directly practice. Reading comprehension is a reflection of the amount of knowledge and vocabulary you have. And this kind of brings the paradox of raising students' reading ability. You need some knowledge and vocabulary to gain more knowledge and vocabulary. So I want to talk a little bit about this, what I think is a pretty important data point here. So the Fordham Institute, based out of Ohio, looked at a very, very large federal data set of kindergartners, almost 20,000 students, and they followed them through 5th grade. And they found that students who received an additional 30 minutes of daily social studies instruction in 1st through 5th grade scored significantly better on reading exams by the end of 5th grade. Okay, I realize that correlation is not causation, and there's some confounding variables here, but I think this is a very interesting study. And what especially and kind of intuitively interested me here was that the largest benefits occurred in students from lower income families, non-English speaking household, and girls. Right? In other words, like middle class and low income children showed the largest improvement on their reading ability with additional time spent in social studies. And if you're thinking about, okay, well, reading is not just decoding, but this amassing of knowledge and vocabulary, this makes sense to me. All right, so just to repeat that again, and to kind of shout out and draw people's attention to, the department also put out not too long ago an excellent webinar about the importance of knowledge building, which is linked here in this slide on this deck, which is in that folder that was probably repeatedly shared in chat now. Right, so reading is not just decoding, but it is also language comprehension. Right, so we need that knowledge and vocabulary plus decoding to really have strong reading comprehension. A typical college freshman begins their first year in school with 60,000 words in their working vocabulary. So if you do kind of the back of the napkin math, that is 10 words a day, 70 words a week, 3,300 words per year. Based on my own experience as a parent, I don't think you learned, 10 words in the delivery room. So, we're learning an immense amount of words very young. And basically what I'm saying here is it really starts and pays off to start early, right? So we are trying to build knowledge in a coherent and purposeful way. That's what the big changes in K-3 we're attempting to do with our new social studies standards. And that's what we would want to continue to try and do with any curriculum and instruction that would be aligned to these standards. All right, so kind of to wrap up this Jeremiah here, we really think social studies will support the development of literacy and reading comprehension. It should not be seen as time taken away from literacy. It should be seen as supporting it. They're natural partners. They're not enemies here. Okay. So let's talk more specifically about each of the grades, like I mentioned at the top here. So we're going to look at kindergarten, and it's just going to be a few moments on each. We only have about another 40 minutes, but I'm going to talk about the kind of biggest, most salient changes in each grade as we see it. Right? If a kindergartner or first grade teacher is like, okay, what's the biggest change? That's what we're going to hit here. And we've, for ease of communicating it, I've kind of divvied it up into, here's the skills that are the biggest changes, here's the biggest changes in content. But so I'm not miscommunicating here. Instructionally in the classroom, these skills and content are always going to go together, right? There really shouldn't ever be a time when the lesson is about, we're learning about cause and effect this week, right? There's always the cause of, what event, right? If you're working on interpreting or creating maps, a map of what? Right? There's always some sort of content. Instructionally, they're merged. Just for our purposes, I've separated them out to talk about the changes here. Right, so let's get right into it. Kindergarten. All right, so the new kindergarten course is titled Life in My Home, School, and Local Community. And of all the 4 grades we're discussing here, kindergarten is the most similar to the 2011 standards, with a few notable exceptions. If you looked at the crosswalks that we released at the summit, you would see this too, that kindergarten, that almost all of the 2011 standards had a 2022 counterpart that was reasonably similar. Though again, there's some slight changes beyond what's on this slide here. The biggest change, though, is certainly this skill around differentiating between primary and secondary sources, right? And notice it's differentiate between. Okay, so can a student tell the difference between something that is written in the time period they're looking at, letter, diary, and autobiography of speech, primary source, and something that is written about that time period later on, an encyclopedia, a textbook, a magazine article. That is certainly the biggest change in terms of skills and what we're expecting kindergartners to do. In terms of content, the 2 standards that don't have a clear analog in the new 2022 standards are K-7 and K-23 here. And I think maybe they could seem a little scary on the surface. Explain the purpose of local government. Again, we're just wanting students to focus on the things in kindergarten that are most concrete and nearest to them, right? We've not totally done away with Piaget and expanding horizons with our new standards here. So for a kindergartner, right, explain the purpose of local government, people in the community working together to improve and solve problems in the community. Right? That is a purpose that a kindergartner, I think, can wrap their head around. And again, we had some feedback on explain why people moved from place to place, because I think it's somewhat being interpreted to how that could look at higher grades. We're not introducing push and pull factor vocabulary here in kindergarten. We're not talking about escaping war and famine, right? For a kindergartner, explaining why people move place to place, looking for a new job, be closer to family and friends, or to the types of activities that people enjoy. That's the type of thing we were imagining here. So if you look at the draft framework we have for kindergarten, we have 4 units. And since this is the first time students are ever outside of their homes being introduced to the social sciences, we have them kind of by discipline as opposed to by topic like they are in the later grades. So we're starting exploring our world, kind of geography, understanding the past, history, understanding wants and needs, economics, and being part of a community, civics. That is not to say that students wouldn't look at a map when they're looking at cultures in Louisiana. Right? It's not that the disciplines are totally siloed here, but we are trying to be purposeful in rolling these out in a way that we think would make sense to a kindergarten student. Again, if you look at the old, what we currently have for kindergarten, some of these topics, they're not radically different. Right? This is, of all these 4 grades, this one is the most similar. All right, moving on to grade 1, which has a good deal of changes. So grade 1's course title is Life in the Great State of Louisiana. And yeah, this course now is still, we think we're still keeping it within the students' kind of concrete experience, but not just in their local community now, but expanded to the state. We still have a standard around differentiating between primary and secondary sources, but now we have a bit more about selecting and using appropriate evidence and constructing and expressing claims. But again, knowing that this is not going to, first grade students are still learning how to read and write. A lot of this is going to be done informally, orally, but we still think that there's claims and evidence that first grade students can wrap their heads around, right? Why is the claim being something like the Mississippi River is important for Louisiana, right? And then looking at various images of how Louisianians use and interact with the Mississippi, right? That's the type of thing we're imagining for first grade. And at the back end of this presentation, we'll share some resources for like how this actually looks in first grade. In terms of content, it's a big change because we have a lot more specific Louisiana history content here. I shouldn't say history so much as it's kind of Louisiana culture. We're really looking at it more in that way, not having students cover all these major events in Louisiana history, but just kind of what makes Louisiana unique and special today. The two standards that stuck out to me as kind of pretty rigorous and big changes were 1.12 and 1.27, fully admitting that 1.27 is a very difficult ask. In our framework, we'll try and give a lot of guidance and support around how to teach that standard, but certainly that is a pretty rigorous thing for a first grader to be able to do. With 112, I would note, notice a lot of this stuff in first grade is still at the identification level, right? So we're not expecting them to speak at length about what the branches do, just what the names of the branches are, right? Trying to set them up for success for what they'll be building on that in second and third grade. Right. And so if we look at the draft framework for grade 1, we have 5 units now: a place called Louisiana, Louisiana history, culture, living and working in Louisiana, being a citizen of Louisiana in the United States, and how our state government works. Again, this is all still being put together. This is still somewhat drafty, but we're trying to give as much time as possible to some of those more difficult and rigorous standards that we now have. Okay, grade 2. The title of this course is now Life in Our Great Country, the United States of America. We have, because the skills and practices around differentiating primary and secondary sources, selecting using appropriate evidence, constructing, expressing claims are very similar to grade 1, which is a general change for all of these grades. In terms of content, the big change for grade 2 is we really are asking now for students to learn some US history. Much more focused than what they're going to see in third grade, but some American history. What stuck out to me is there is certainly a greater focus on geography now in grade 2, both kind of just the most broad understandings of geography, the continents, the oceans, hemispheres. But then more specifically on North American geography and identifying key features in North America. The other large standout to me was 210. I think this probably is one of the most rigorous kind of blocks of standards. I didn't include the substandards here because they wouldn't all fit on this one slide. But identify and describe the principles of American democracy. I can see how this could be stress-inducing to imagine teaching this to a second grader. Again, we have some resources we're going to point to at the end here to kind of bring this back down to earth and show what this actually looks like in a second grade class. But let me actually talk over the first page of the framework here. I think this might be more helpful. So you can see we're again starting with a lot of time spent on setting the stage with geography, which should be building off what students learned in kindergarten and first. But then we do have some actual US history. So we're starting from indigenous North America, the first peoples in North America, and moving through the Revolution and the Constitution. This is going to be really, really critical for setting up students for success in third grade, where they are going to cover some of this material again. But if the first time they cover it is in third grade, it's going to be very, very challenging. So I think it's really, really important that this time is spent in second grade on this initial learning of US history here, especially the stuff around the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And again, we're going to share some resources that teachers can start to look at the end here to see how this will look in class. All right, just trying to stay on time here. Finally, we have grade 3, which of all the grades changing, this is probably the biggest change. So no longer is grade 3 Louisiana state history. It is no longer a survey of Louisiana history. It is now a survey, and I apologize, by survey, I just mean a kind of broad pass through. A survey of American history, right? The title is The American Story, People, Places, and Papers. We now have a kind of a different strand of skills and practices around expressing claims. Many people at Summit noticed 3.4D here describe counterclaims. I would say that, right, these skills and practices here, they might be written the same in each grade level, but it's still going to look a little different in 3rd than it does in 5th. And we'll be able to give more guidance on what kind of counterclaims you would want students to think about when they're drafting their own responses to questions. Certainly there's some examples that are kind of out there and inappropriate, and that's not what was intended here. But anyway, the big change for 3rd grade is that it's this U.S. history survey, and that they're going to cover the sort of major events in U.S. history, and they're basically listed in 3.7. So we have American Revolution, Louisiana Purchase, Lewis and Clark Expedition, Corps of Discovery, slavery, experience of enslaved people, abolition. Notice the focus is not on the Civil War, right? That the students are not going to be doing an in-depth look at the battles and personalities in the Civil War in 3rd grade. They are just going to be learning just about, in general, institution of slavery, what that meant, and how it was abolished. Then they're going to look at women's suffrage movement, civil rights movement, and kind of very briefly the modern age and the space race. That's a lot. So just to be clear, they're going to have a different kind of resolution here of U.S. history than students are going to get when they cover this again in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and then of course in high school as well. Lower resolution, but not dishonest. And it's just going to look different. Again, I think the most rigorous change, that maybe potentially the most difficult standard to teach here, is 3.10, which is we are raising the expectations around their civic knowledge in 3rd grade here. Right? And again, I'm going to go back. That's why it's so important that we start building that foundation in 1st and especially in 2nd. But we're going to be asking them to describe, how a bill becomes a law. This is kind of the schoolhouse rock civics here. Now they actually have to describe what those branches they named in 1st grade do. Not the same way you would do it in a high school civics course, but legislative branch makes laws, right? Executive branch enforces them, this type of thing. Describing how representative democracy is different than monarchy. This set is probably the biggest, most difficult standard in 3rd grade now. Right, and if you look, you could see that 3rd grade, the framework is very busy here. There's a lot. There's a lot to cover, and that means it's going to have to move briskly and look a little different than it is when they get back here in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So again, we're starting not with the 13 colonies here, but with the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. We have almost 4 weeks around the Constitutional Convention and how the government works. Some time again to review some of the North American geography they covered in grade 2 and learn about some of the most important symbols of our country before moving on to studying the Louisiana Purchase, which is probably one of the only bits of content that remains the same for grade 3 teachers. Then they're going to look at settling the West and what that meant for American Indians, Native Americans. They're going to look at how the North, South, and West developed and changed, and how slavery was involved in that, and how slavery was abolished, how cities grew and the new technology from the Industrial Revolution, Theodore Roosevelt, and a little bit about the conservation movement, women's suffrage, the civil rights movement, and then, like I said, some time on some more modern advancements, the space race and the digital age. So a lot in 3rd grade. Okay, that was a whole bunch. So I want to turn now to talk about some more concrete stuff that we've put together and what we think would be appropriate to have K-3 teachers begin to do in whatever form their professional learning takes at their school site or parish or district to prepare for these new standards. Because we are trying to kind of walk a line here. We want people to be proactive and be ready for this shift, but also knowing that, people are teaching the 2011 standards that are still in effect this school year. And if you're a third grade teacher, you're going to be assessed by the state on them. So we kind of try and walk that line here. So here's the three kind of buckets of things we think would be appropriate for K-3 teachers to start doing. One would be to build their own content knowledge about the topics in the standards and the courses they're teaching. So if you're a third grade teacher that's been teaching Louisiana history for a long time, and that's wonderful, the content of your class is radically changing, and maybe you haven't thought about slavery and abolition in a minute, or the Declaration of Independence, et cetera, et cetera. So building teacher content knowledge to support the new standards is probably the most important thing people could do. And we're going to point you to some places and things that teachers can use to do that. Secondly, we want elementary teachers to understand the why and how behind using primary sources in elementary school, right? So that they have the capacity and the comfort and hopefully the desire to use as many primary sources as possible with students. And we've kind of created something to hopefully facilitate that. And then lastly, we think it would be worthwhile, since our frameworks are not done yet and will not be until the spring, that we can have teachers look at some high quality sets of sources that are organized the same way our frameworks ultimately will be, so they can kind of get a better idea of what the finished product they're going to have is going to look like. So we've kind of curated some stuff made by other states that we think is pretty good, that they could begin to look at now. And honestly, some of it you probably could actually use, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. All right, so let's talk about the first one here, building content knowledge. So what to use? Now there's no shortage of YouTube videos or Nat Geo articles or things of this nature that are pretty easy to find. The problem here, I think, might be, though, is if you're a second grade teacher and you have to teach the Constitution, you have the standards that hopefully are pretty clear, but it still might be a little like, okay, but how does the Constitution, how does teaching that in grade 2 really look? And one of the best resources we found around this is the teacher guides that have been created by Core Knowledge for their materials. So let me just explain a little bit about this. Core Knowledge is a nonprofit based out of Virginia that has ELA product, CKLA. I'm not talking about that now. They have a history and geography product called Core Knowledge History and Geography. And in kindergarten through third grade, a lot of their materials, though they certainly do not align perfectly to our standards, and this is in no way, I'm not endorsing their product here. It's not gone through our IMR process. But their teacher guides, I think, are really excellent. And they do a very good job of walking this line between being, really accurate history, but also being concise and approachable. So I'm just going to walk through a few screenshots here so you can kind of see in that same folder that's probably been shared multiple times in the chat now. There's a document in there called Core Knowledge Teacher Guides, where you'll be able to click to links of things we found that we think are pretty close. So how these are organized, the teacher guides, the first page is kind of what students need to learn, and they have this bullet pointed list of sort of the essential things about whatever this topic is. And again, we read through these, and it's not always absolutely perfect, but generally speaking, pretty close to where we would be heading. So you can kind of get a list of, okay, these are the salient points that students would need to learn. But what we really like about these guides is a section called What Teachers Need to Know. And what they do here is they give these concise explanations of whatever that topic is here. So here's an example from, what is a constitution? And I think these are excellent guides to being like, how does this actually, what are the kinds of things I would be saying to a second grader when I'm explaining what the Constitution is and why it's important? And this repeats for a lot of the different topics that we have in kindergarten through third, with, of course, the exception being first grade here, because Louisiana state history is not covered in their materials because their materials are for a national audience. But this is one resource we think is pretty great, something you could somewhat reliably used with kindergarten, second and third grade teachers as being, you want to build your knowledge, but not read a collegiate textbook on that topic, right? So for example, you could read, there's an amazing historian, McPherson, who wrote an unbelievable book about the Civil War called Enduring Freedom, but that's not a good book to prepare you to teach abolition in grade 2. But the core knowledge guide around the Civil War is pretty good. Okay, so that's one resource. Actually, I'm sorry, I should have just shown this here. This is what our kind of the PDF in that folder looks like. It just links to each of these topics. They don't have material that covers any of our economic stuff. Like I said, it is not aligned fully, but it's something. All right. For first grade teachers who are looking to build their knowledge about Louisiana state history, there really is no better free resource than 64 Parishes. The website is .org. There's also a magazine that you can pay to subscribe to, but the free online encyclopedia, I think, really is the best free available source for Louisiana state history. So you could read all the, they have almost 1,000 articles about Louisiana history topics, many of the ones that are mentioned in the first grade standards as examples. But they are quite weedy sometimes and long because they really are written for high school, college students. However, we're in the process of creating a bunch of student-facing articles about Louisiana state history. Our first round only covered 4th through 8th grade. But for example, if you're a first grade teacher who's going to, the Acadians or one of those cultural groups that you're going to be teaching about, and you don't want to read the 20-page entry about them, you could read our 6th grade 1-page entry about them, and that would be a pretty good primer, for teaching this to a first grader. But then more exciting is that we have kind of renewed this partnership with Louisiana Endowment of Humanities, and late this year, early next year, we will be releasing articles to support first grade teachers. And these are just some of the topics. If you've looked at the kindergarten or first grade standards, right, these are the examples, some of the examples that are given under various types of culture things. So you can look for these. They will be in our frameworks for first grade when we release them, but they will first appear on 64 Parishes website. It's this URL right here, 64parishes.org/education. And we'll put out that info in the various newsletters and probably on social media when we have those first grade articles available. Okay, moving to talking about how, so we want teachers to build content knowledge, and then we also want them to know the why and how around primary sources in K-3. So to help facilitate that, we made this thing we're calling our K-3 primary source guide. We will do this with the other grades as well. Again, that's in that folder we shared at the beginning. And this thing we're hoping does a few things for teachers, right? So it gets them talking about why primary sources are important to use. What are some guidelines from using them in K-3? And then we've created a whole bunch of graphic organizers and verbal cues. How can these support students grappling with difficult primary sources? So I want to just look at some screenshots of this guide. Of course, please look through it yourself though. So the second page of the guide, we kind of give our why, right? Why we think primary sources are so important and why they're helpful for students. And I guess the headline reason is if you're introducing the idea of point of view, I can't really think of a better way to do it than by using primary sources, right? Certainly you could read a secondary text that tries to, get to each point of view, but I think coming straight from the source, I think is just more engaging. And we want students to feel that that history is alive, right? Because it is. It's a process. It's an interpretive process that we are constantly refining and updating as more information becomes available. And we want students to know that and engage in that in a great appropriate way, but as early as is possible. So we have the kind of why here, and then hopefully what we've really tried to do is give a how to use primary sources. So within this guide, we have this type of frame here where we have students observe, think, wonder, and question about various types of sources. So we have different questions here, different verbal cues for text sources, photographs, audio, video, maps, political cartoons. I'm probably going to start repeating myself, so I'm going to stop. But essentially, any kind of primary source you could think of here. And these verbal cues are unique to each type of source. So here we have a example. This is some basketry. I believe it might be cheating matcha or Choctaw. I can't remember. I apologize. But a basket you could actually, purchase and bring in as an artifact in the first grade classroom to look at. So these verbal cues would be the type of questions that teachers would prompt students to answer, but hopefully ultimately that students would begin to sort of ask themselves and kind of internalize to begin, thinking critically about sources they're going to be exposed to here. So I'm just going to read some examples here, right? So like, what is the size, shape, smell, and color of the object? Where do you think it came from? What was it used for? Is it complete? Is it missing some pieces? And then, ultimately having the students try and generate their own questions about an object or things that confuse them about it. And then at the bottom of each of these pages, we have just some real brief examples of some what we hope are kind of fun activities that could be done with that type of source. That's the kind of thing that we're going to elaborate on much more in that instructional strategy bank that I mentioned at the beginning of the call. But this is something for now. So then following each of these kind of protocols here, we have a graphic organizer specific to that type of source. And again, understanding that for emerging readers and writers here, this is the kind of thing that is going to be led by the teacher, where the teacher is drawing pictures in a few words on a smarter whiteboard at the front. But as students become more proficient, then they can record answers and their own responses. A lot of different ways this could be broached, but I just want to acknowledge that we're not expecting a kindergartner to record all their answers here. Okay, and then lastly, I mentioned we wanted to give some more completed examples of the type of thing in the same vein as our course frameworks ultimately will be in. And so again, if you look in that folder we shared, there should be a PDF called Exemplar Source Sets. So we went and looked at some materials that have been made by New York, Georgia, and Arkansas teachers and pulled what we thought was some of the better source sets to give an idea of like what kind of sources are we talking about here for kindergarten, first and second. And it's a lot of images, right? It's a lot of illustrations because that's the kind of thing that's going to be in their kind of zone of proximal development here. Of all the states we looked at here, though, the strongest materials were almost certainly made by Iowa. So the Iowa's Department of Ed, in concert with the Library of Congress, made a whole bunch of source sets, some of them very specific to Iowa, to be honest, but some of them very broad that could certainly cover a lot of the civics material that we have, civic standards rather, we have K-3. But they look like this, right? Very similar to how our frameworks will ultimately be organized. So they have a series of sources, mostly images, organized around supporting and framing questions. So I would just highly recommend everyone check this out. The link is on this page of the slide here. You can actually search the Iowa source set by topic, which is wonderful because of course they have totally different standards than we do, but some of the topics are absolutely things that appear in our K-3 sequence. So really like their stuff. Highly recommend you check it out. But then we also went, like I said, and looked at some other states and pulled all these materials into our drive, so the links won't break here, I promise. That do cover some of the topics that we have K through 3. Just another thing that teachers can look at to see, like, okay, what, we saw the bare bones of this framework thing, but what is this really going to look like in the end? It'll look like this material here. Okay. All right, so that was a lot of me talking, but I just want to run through again and recap kind of the big things here before we open up the space for some questions, additional questions in the chat. So what supports will the department be releasing? Okay, we are currently reviewing, or rather we're open to reviewing new submissions, new social studies instructional material submissions. We have a new rubric we're very proud of to do it with. We are still going to be releasing these course frameworks, which are replacements for the scope and sequence documents. spring, summer 2023, like I said, probably mid-April. And we will be releasing a robust bank of instructional strategies and generic activities that can be used in social studies classrooms at the same time. Right? How does social studies support the development of literacy? It supports it. It does not detract from it. Building knowledge about the world is a key condition for reading comprehension. Right? Decoding is necessary but not sufficient to be a strong reader. So social studies is not the enemy of literacy. And then how can K-3 teachers begin to prepare for the transition? They can build their content knowledge using the resources we just talked about or other things. And about that too, if people want additional resources for building content knowledge, that's certainly something we could investigate. It wouldn't be out of bounds to say like, oh, there are certainly some good books that offer overviews of American history, Louisiana state history that could be good for kind of book studies in whatever kind of form professional learning takes it at their school site. And we'd be happy to talk further about that, maybe not on this call, but on a one-to-one basis here. So they can build their content knowledge. We want them thinking about why and hopefully internalizing that primary sources are important in elementary school and understanding how to use them with students in kindergarten through third grade. And then again, looking at some of these strong source sets and starting to think about what makes a source good for what makes a source a good instructional source in kindergarten, first and second and third grade.